Hello and welcome to Call to the Workforce. I am so excited to welcome Stacey Unck to the podcast today. Stacey taught English in China when she was 19 years old and returned home to obtain a bachelor's degree in Mandarin Chinese. She started her career in sales as a recruiter and moved into pharmaceutical sales at Eli Lilly. Since then, she's worked in the tech industry, first in a sales role and eventually transitioning to sales enablement, where she helps sales teams maintain the knowledge and skills they need to be successful. She has worked at Tableau, Lucid Software, and is currently the Director of Sales Enablement at Master Control. She's also been a musician who did her own managing, booking, and producing. More recently, she has volunteered with Scout Troops, and in 2023, she helped her Utah International Scout Troop of 25 refugee teenage girls and boys from Thailand, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Somalia go to the World Scout Jamboree in South Korea. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for having me. I love what you're doing here.
I am excited to have you here. And I think before we jump into all of the stuff, I have to say that you told me something a few weeks ago, and I have not been able to stop thinking about this story of how you got there. So can you please tell us the real story of what the experience has been like?
Yeah, sure. So the real life story of my career has been successes and failures and kind of everything in between. And I feel like a short bio like that can sound great. And what it does is it leaves out a lot of the struggle and a lot of the hard-earned lessons that are part of my past. So I want to tell you the story. I want to first, though, cover kind of one of the things that I wish someone would have told me when I was first starting my career. And that is put your head down, work hard, and success will follow. Because entry-level jobs aren't what we really thought we'd grow up to do, right? And they can be monotonous and they can be hard. And sometimes early on, it's hard to catch a vision of what your future can look like. And so what I'd like to do is tell the story to help us get context with that. So I got my first job about 2 weeks before graduating from college, which was super stressful. And it was a good job at a good company. And I was super grateful for the experience. And I also felt like, is this it? And I felt like there was some aspects of it that felt kind of monotonous. And at that time, I looked around at my peers and I felt like all of us were in jobs either that we weren't like really as satisfied by after a little bit of time, or that we couldn't get the jobs that we really wanted. And it was kind of frustrating. And so that first job, learned a ton. As it came time where I knew I wanted to move into pharma, I actually left that job and took a seasonal position. And a few months later, after the seasonal job's over, and I still don't have that job at Lilly that I'm really fighting for, I find myself sleeping on my friend's futon, working at Costco, wearing a bright vest and a rain jacket, holding a rope with a hook on it, out in the Northwest storm, gathering carts at Costco. And I remember like stopping and saying, I felt like I was like my mom. I was like, Stacey, you have a degree and 2 years of pretty solid experience. What are you doing? Have you peaked? Is this it? Is this as good as it gets? And I just like to tell that story because it kind of illustrates like we all have times of either things that aren't as exciting or unemployment that can really feel scary early on in our career. I guess to continue the story, I did get the job at Lilly, and it honestly was sold to me as like the hardest territory in the United States. And I was super hungry, and so I took it. And woof, they were so right. Like it was super hard. And again, I just thought, am I ever going to make it? Will I ever succeed? And fast forward a few years, I'm the person walking across the stage, getting the awards. I had good success, learned a lot of cool things while I was working at Lilly. I get this cool opportunity to shift over to tech and work at Tableau. And a year into that, I wake up one day and I'm just excited to go to work. And it dawns on me, I am doing a job that I want to be doing right now. And similarly, I looked around at my peers and my friends, and we're in our 30s at this time, and they're getting job offers of jobs they want. And I looked back on that and I thought, The reason we're getting these job offers is because of those entry level jobs and those first jobs where we put our heads down and we learned and we figured out how business works, even if the work was not as glamorous as we wanted it to be. I just feel like I could have maybe avoided some of that stress or fear in my 20s if someone had told me, like, you got to put your time in here because that experience is going to be priceless for you to get the job and have the career that you want in the future.
I remember having a similar experience and thinking, I had loved my job at first, and then it was like, is this what I do for the rest of my life? So I really appreciate that. And something that I think you've highlighted well is that it takes time to get there. So you've had this foundation that has built some good success. And part of the reason that you have found success is because of the relationships you've developed with your partners, colleagues, and your bosses. And I would love to know some of the things that you've learned. And let's just start about what you have learned about being a good colleague.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, peopling is an aspect of work and it's awesome and it can be frustrating. And a couple of those hard earned lessons for me were understanding that rising tides rise all boats. And secondly, the way that we make people feel is more important than we think. So I'll start with the rising tides rise all boats. I'm pretty competitive. I have a career in sales, so that shouldn't be super surprising. And earlier in my career, I would see someone walk across the stage, and instead of feeling excitement for them, I honestly felt frustration. And I would, even when I got into tech sales and someone would close a big deal, I would sometimes it would ruin my day if I was having a bad quarter. And I just thought, ugh, it was a pretty hard struggle for me, Emily.
This is something I have heard happens in when you're in sales. And we could all look at this and say we look at other people and we see them doing well and we wonder about ourselves. It's easy for us to step into that, whether we're in sales or not. So, how did you work through that? And what would you share with people who are listening to this and thinking, you're my person? I get that.
I get you and you get me. Yeah. So this is when that concept of rising tides, rise all boats came in. And I actually saw it modeled really well at Tableau. And I had some coworkers who were just really good at celebrating other people's victory, no matter how they were doing. And I loved how that made me feel. And I love that look. And then in contrast, throughout my career, I've seen people who've acted out in ways that are more competitive or that display jealousy. And I really did not like how that felt and how that looked. So I realized that I needed to change my thoughts. And a couple of the thoughts that helped me were success is not a finite resource, and other people's success can be my success. I think when we think about success not being a finite resource, what I've noticed is there's like a lot of success to go around. And the more we acknowledge it and the more we celebrate it, the more abundant it seems. I had a team at Lucid where every Monday morning we'd talk about the things that people had done the week before. And we'd talk about what we were proud of and then what we were proud of someone else doing. And it was honestly like a love fest. And we'd always tease ourselves about it. But in that setting, it honestly felt like we were doing so many amazing things and there wasn't a sense of competition because everybody was getting celebrated. So that was really powerful. And then I guess to wrap that up, I think if, let's say, for example, a woman gets a role in a mostly male dominated department, that's such a win for me because they're paving the way for women in that department. Or if someone's sales closes a really big deal at a company and I have a deal open, then I can tell that company about the other company that chose our product. And that's going to help me close that deal. So I just think other people's success can definitely be our success. And we have to shift our thoughts as we approach that.
I really like the phrase that you used with the rising tides. Let's see if I can get this right. Rising tides rise all boats. Because you're right, we do have to make a conscious decision to not engage in comparing, but instead to engage in saying, this will help me. So I love that. You also mentioned that it's important how you make people feel. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think this is relevant. Like you said earlier, for anybody in any direction, up, down, sideways. And my thoughts on this changed about 8 years ago when I was at a company kickoff at Tableau, and the CEO, Adam Slipsky, he takes time out of his address to the entire company to give some career advice. And what he decided to share was honestly a little bit riveting to me. So he said, look back on your career and look for patterns where you've bumped up against conflict or frustration and things that have held you back. Consider those situations and then take a minute to consider if you're the problem. And he just stopped with that. And I felt super implicated by what he said based on some situations I was in. At the same time, I'm at this conference in this EQ, like a breakout around EQ. At Lilly, EQ was a big thing. And I was like, no, I'm really good at EQ. Like, I got this. But I want to go here and confirm that I'm really good at it. And they start talking about how it's important for us to be aware of how our emotions impact other people. And they start sharing slide after slide of examples of what that doesn't look like. And the slides were familiar. And it was really, really uncomfortable.
Yeah. It's one of those moments that you maybe want to close your eyes for a minute and let that belong to somebody else. You're like, oh, I'm actually just thinking of someone else. You're thinking of yourself. You see yourself. So they can be growing moments or they can be stunting moments, and you have a choice. So how did you respond? Because those are the moments that I think we can make or break a career.
Yeah. I mean, again, it wasn't a look I liked, and it wasn't how I wanted to be represented. And so I focused on it and I started practicing it. And I got it right sometimes and I got it wrong sometimes. And if I'm honest, it's still something I'm practicing and probably will be for the rest of my life. But I will say in the last year, I've started at a new company, and I've really made a commitment to focus almost as much on partnering and how I make people feel as I do on my work.
Can you give us an example of that? Because I think this really plays into being a good partner as well, which was the second relationship that we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, sure. I think that when it comes to being a good partner, I want my partners to know that I have their back, that they can expect me to be kind, and that I'm going to make their life better. And so I think one of the really helpful phrases that I've used here has been, how can I help you? So let me give you a scenario. When you're working with a partner in like a cross-functional, you're working with someone in a different department, you're not their leader. They do have the skills and the expertise in that area. So they do need to be doing that work. But it might be a really high priority project for you, and it might be like a medium project for them. And if you've agreed upon a deadline, and let's say they're not meeting the deadline, you really have a few choices. So first, you can nag and be totally passive aggressive and just hard to work with. Second,
That's my favorite. I love it when people do that.
do the
I
nag.
love, yes,
It definitely makes you
yes.
want to work for them, right?
Yeah, totally.
The second is you can email them and their boss and say, when can I expect to see this? Which is, I think, even worse than the first one. And I think the final is, I know you're really busy. How can I help? What I've found that to do is just have this sense of acknowledging their world and their busyness. And a lot of times they'll either take you up on the help or they'll get it done because they're like, you're right. I can finish this real fast. And thanks for being cool. So,
Mhm. As you were talking, I thought if I were to break this down really simply, I would say you could be a nag, you could be a nuke, because you nuke the relationship when when you CC someone's boss, you nuke the relationship, or you can be a good neighbor and
I like that.
be supportive. So be a good neighbor, don't be a nuke or a nag. And I love this that you have this invitation, which I think is humble, to be able to say, how can I help? As compared to, it sets aside really your ego in a lot of ways. And it reminds me of something that I had to learn a long time ago, which is, and this relates to the bosses that we work with. And it's essentially this, that as we work with bosses and managers, and I'm not talking unethical ones, but it's generally speaking, most of the people I know are really they're really trying to be good people. And I've found that it's really important to be able to say to your boss, will you mentor me on this? Or as people come to us and say they're frustrated, to say, I believe you, but being open to that more human side of things. We,
Yeah, I
you
like
know,
those.
yeah, they're good little one-liners to just
Hmm.
stick in your back pocket and yet also to live them as well. Like you can use the line, but if you say, will you mentor me? And then you're like, okay, I'm done listening. That doesn't achieve the objective. You actually have to let the person mentor you and help you. We do know that there are political situations at work. So we've been talking about having these good relationships with your colleagues, with your peers, with your boss. And I think if we don't acknowledge that there are politics, people would have questions. So, any quick thoughts or words of wisdom for people who are dealing with politics?
Yeah, we're always going to bump up against people who are just maybe a little bit more difficult, or maybe don't have our best interest in mind, or whatever it may be. And I would just hold your head high, live your values, consider what it would be like to look back on how you acted and make sure it's something you'd be proud of. And then I think something we all have to do is be willing to consider our part, because there's something about the way someone is acting towards you that has to do with maybe you digging your heels in a little bit, or you saying or doing something that has led to it. And if you have a clear conscience on that, conscience? Yeah, if you have a clear conscience on that one and you feel good about it, then hold your head high and hold your values, and it'll pass.
I always think that the best way to play politics is to pour water on the fire. And what
Hmm.
you've just described is, am I adding fuel to the fire or am I adding water?
I
So if
love that
somebody's,
imagery.
yeah, so if someone's gossiping, do we get frustrated and then turn around and gossip? Or do we just say to them, I choose not to engage in conversations like this. I want to speak well of my colleagues,
Mhm.
right? It's a
Yes,
wet
I love
blanket
that.
moment. Yeah, it's such a wet blanket moment and just a good question of, am I fuel or fire?
Yeah.
Wait, that's both. Water. Water or fuel.
Sign me up to be that wet blanket. Like, I'm all for
Yeah.
it. That's great. I love it.
Let's wrap this up by talking about that last category, which is how this plays out in terms of being a good boss.
Yeah, I think that this was actually modeled really well for me in one of my roles, where the manager just saw us as humans and put the human ahead of the work. And I think one of the principles that I think is really important is that more work gets done when people are emotionally healthy. And as a boss, I've had times where I made space for it and times where I didn't early on. And I quickly learned that if someone was spinning out on something or was like really thrown by something, I needed to just talk to them, ask them what's going on, listen, take a minute. It might have to do with work and it might have to do with family and might be completely unwork related, and that's okay. But I think we are spending half of our waking hours with these people, and the things they do at work are only half of their life. And that impacts the way they show up, and that impacts the way they work. And we have to be willing to sit in it with them.
Yeah. When we were preparing, you brought up this concept that we can have love in the workplace. And we're Christian. We think about Jesus Christ. And certainly this is a podcast where we're talking about faith concepts. So it is an interesting idea to think about, how do we bring love into the workplace? It's not something we talk about. Like we don't normally think of it in those terms. Yet if we're trying to treat people well, like Jesus Christ did, we would apply that principle. So can you tell me, for you, what it looks like to have love in the workplace?
As humans, we're just designed to connect and bond. And there's no reason that we need to shortchange that due to professional situations as long as we keep things obviously professional. But I think if we share our lives and we learn about each other, we're naturally going to bond. And I've tried really hard and made it a point not to shy away from asking what's really going on. You can tell when someone's off. And I think that, again, people who are emotionally healthy are going to get the best work done. And so when we sit down and we listen and we cry with people or we laugh with people, it's going to not only help the work, which is obviously really important, but it's going to help the relationship. And I can say some of my best relationships in my life have been with my coworkers, direct reports, leaders, whatever area. And often it's because we've experienced some pretty big things in life, illnesses, death, loss of jobs, things like that. And we've helped each other out. We've let each other talk and we've just sat in that hard with each other. So I think that makes a really big difference.
There's a concept in coaching called clearing. And essentially the concept is this, that if people have big things going on, until it's acknowledged, it's really hard for them to move on. And sometimes you think, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to listen to this for 2 hours. A lot of times you don't have to. One of the things in one of the books that I was reading about this, they talk about how if you ask someone to acknowledge what's going on, they'll maybe acknowledge like 70% of it or something. That's a made up number. I'm sure the book didn't say that 70%, but they don't give it all up. And yet if you push them and say, can you just actually really tell me how you feel? If they really let it out, they'll hit this moment, and it can happen pretty quickly where they're like, okay, I feel like I'm done. Let's move on. Let's get to the work, right?
Yeah.
But I think a lot about that. Sometimes what we're asking people to do is hold their breath.
I
And
like
they
that.
they have to let it out and fully let it out. And once they've let it out, they're ready to take that big gasp of air and move on and get going.
Yeah. And Emily, I have a quick thought on that. Like sometimes they're going to be the person who says, I'm ready, let's move on. And sometimes, like that magical phrase I talked about earlier, how can I help, is another thing, right? So maybe we've worked with them on some of the emotions, or maybe they're not ready to talk or something, but something needs to get done. And instead of like really, again, nagging or pushing or setting up a plan or something, I think the times when I've been most successful as a leader has been when I've said, how can I help? And that might look like turning a one-on-one into a working session, offering to do the outline or first draft of something, or even gathering the entire team for 1 hour later in the afternoon and saying, we're all going to work to help Emily get this thing across the finish line. She's so close. Sometimes people need that little boost and that little bit of help, especially if they're in their heads and they're having a hard time coming out. And when they start to see their leaders and their team members like rally behind them, it's pretty powerful.
Oh, I love that. So let's take a little bit of a shift. We've talked about success and failure from a work career perspective. And let's talk about this from a faith perspective. How have you seen how have you seen successes and failures playing out in your faith life?
Yeah, I think that the principles are actually not that different. If you think about in work, understanding in your 20s that things will be better in your 30s and 40s, having that sense of vision is really powerful. And I think when it comes to faith, the big picture is also so powerful. And from a faith standpoint, I believe that God loves us a lot. And I believe that he wants us to return to him and that he's prepared for us a world described in Job as too wonderful to understand. And in order for us to be able to be useful to him while we're after this life, we have to learn things here and we have to go through these life experiences. We have to experience death and loss of relationships or jobs or failures, and we have to experience victories and success and all of it. All of it is part of us, I think, like becoming. And for me, I think the focus on becoming has been really powerful so that any experience that I have, positive or negative, I can just think, what was I supposed to learn from this? And sometimes I'll just think, I wonder what thing's going to come either in this life or the next where this experience is something I draw upon. And I think that attitude of hope and curiosity has served me a lot better than thoughts that are more aligned to like resentment or bitterness.
Mhm. I think there's something really powerful about this story because we do have those moments where things feel really like things are not working out. There's and I don't know if I'll remember the name of it, but there's a worship song that talks about how if things are bad, you haven't seen the rest of the story yet. And I think I've seen that in my life where you have moments that you're like, man, this is so bad. And then you make it through and you find yourself resilient and doing better. Do you have an example of how this has played out for you?
Yeah, I think I have the positive and the negative example on this one. So a while back, I had something happen at work that just like really threw me. And I wasn't really focused on this concept of becoming. And I realized that I had put a lot of my worth and value on my job and everyone like being satisfied with my work. And I think through that experience and it pushing me to lean on God and ask for help and ask for understanding, I have been able to shift more towards my job doesn't define me. It's something where I get to go and serve and be useful and create relationships. And fast forward a little bit after that, I found myself unexpectedly without a job. And while that was certainly hard, it was like a night and day difference from that earlier experience because I just had that perspective of this is happening for a reason. There's something I'm supposed to be learning here. And I had a plan about how this all was going to turn out. And that plan isn't working out. And it turns out God's ways are better than my ways, always. And if it didn't turn out how I thought, that means it's going to turn out better. And I believe that has happened. And it's true. Life is better right now. So that's the experience I've had.
We've talked a lot in just this last little bit about the future and what can come, that things can be better and you want to be resilient. And I think the other concept that comes to mind is that also you use the phrase become, which I always think when we think about this is one of those phrases in the LDS community that really means we're trying to be like Jesus. Can we get a little bit better every day? And where's the potential for us? Can we just be a little bit more like him in how we treat people, in our character, and who the kind of people we want to be? I think about that as I think about, which I think is really an invitation of just saying, do your best. So, on a somewhat related note, in 2018, the leader of our church, President Russell M. Nelson, said something to the women in our church, which also invites them to step up and contribute and do good. He said this, he said, we need you. We need your leadership ability, your wisdom, and your voices. And I know for me, sometimes I see women doubting their capabilities or their talents or wondering how things are going to turn out or how things will go. What have you learned about cultivating your leadership voice in a volunteer or church setting?
I attended a conference a few weeks ago and through the church, and there was a statistic shared where a survey was done, and women rated themselves as having, in one scenario, feeling grounded in their faith. The second option, feeling like they had faith, but they were like it's easier for the world and other things to influence them. And then the third was struggling with faith and losing faith. Then it turned out the data showed a bell curve, right? But there was this secondary data point that really resonated with me. And it was that this group who felt grounded in their faith, of that group, few of them felt a sense of urgency or confidence to share and to lead out and to lead others to Jesus Christ. And I just believe this is a real problem because the world needs people who model faith and people who, like you said, live like Jesus Christ. And they need to see that you can do that and have joy and peace and be happy. And ask like how that works out. I think there's a few things that really come into play here. The first is having a clear vision. It goes back to the stuff we were talking about earlier and the work stuff. But as far as being a strong leader, we need to have a clear vision of God's goodness and his plan for us. And we can get that vision through his scriptures. We can get that vision in the temple. And I think it'll really help us feel stronger and more confident to stand and lead out and speak out. And then another story that I'm just a huge fan of is in 2 Kings 6, the story of Elisha. I think we need to recognize the reality of this story. He has this servant, they're at war, and they look and they see all of these chariots and horses, and the enemy is like outnumbers them a lot. And he turns to Elisha and he says, how would we ever beat this group? And Elisha prays to the Lord that the servant can see the mountainside. And he looks and his eyes are open to see a mountainside full of chariots and horses of fire. And he's able to proclaim, they that be with us are more than they that be with them. And I think this concept is so powerful. It's very personal to me as someone who's lost some really important people in the last few years. That when I am asked to do hard things or I'm asked to stand up and speak out, that there are so many people who've gone before us who are part of the hosts of heaven that are helping us do what we need to do.
I think about friends of mine who have lost family members who will talk about how they feel like there's a closeness there, or they still feel like, gosh, I feel like there was a movie the other day that I was watching and there was this concept of someone had lost their spouse and they said after about a year, I don't feel that person with me anymore. But there's many people in many faiths who feel like we have people who are there who encourage us. And do we just in general feel like God will help us? Or that we have just heavenly help in our life.
And there's talk of the hosts of heaven, and so many people have gone before us. And I really do think they're present and they're helping us. And I think the last thing that I'll say about having a confident leadership voice is that the whole point of being a leader in a church setting or a religious or a faith-based setting is to bring other people to Jesus Christ. And the best way to do that is to understand Jesus Christ and his gospel. And so we really should feel a sense of urgency to increase our knowledge and our understanding. And that means spending time, like significant time in the scriptures and in holy places and listening to talks and podcasts of people who've made a living studying religion and feeding our spirits and our minds. And this is the way that we become that conduit of his life. The more we understand the word and the truth, the real truth of the gospel, and also the more we are pure in a way that allows us to be a conduit of his life, the more powerful we'll be when we stand up and have something to say in any kind of setting.
If you were going to bottom line this in really simple terms, what's the big takeaway from what you've just shared?
From specifically about leadership, what I've just shared?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the bottom line is you can be a leader, and you can do that by believing in what's the plan that there is, by believing that there are people supporting you that you don't realize are there, and by putting some work in to really understand God and his word and his ways. That would be what I'd say there.
I have so much appreciated all of the time and the effort you've put into thinking about these things and coming to the table to share this with everyone. Something I really love and appreciate about what you've shared are some of the one-liners that are really things people can take with them. And then also your heart, just the things that you have on your heart. We always like to end with a sort of message of encouragement or hope for other people. What is the message of encouragement that you would want to share?
My message is that the best is yet to come, that you will be successful, and you just need to believe it. You need to be good to people, be good to others, and watch God take care of you, and it'll happen.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we jump off, I've got some great news for you. I am happy to announce that we are going to do season 2 of the podcast. We so much appreciate everybody who's given just really encouraging and helpful feedback. And we are looking forward to getting some additional conversations out there for you to listen to. They will probably launch at the end of 2024. So if you want to know when those come out, you need to make sure that you are signed up for our newsletter, which you can do by going to www.calltotheworkforce.com. And there will be a pop-up that will take you to our Substack newsletter, which you can subscribe to. And that's where we will be announcing when the new episodes release. Number 2, as we have listened to the feedback, we want to continue to help you develop both professionally and personally. And we recognize a major need for help is for women to learn how to negotiate for the next pay raise or for the next job. We have added to that website, www.calltotheworkforce.com, a resource page. On that resource page, you will find links to organizations who have put together great courses or resources that can teach you how to negotiate for, like I said, the next pay increase or the next role. And we want to make sure that you have that resource. The next announcement and the final one is that we have received such great feedback that we want to help you to continue to get the most out of the podcast. In July, around July 15th, we are going to release a set of worksheets that can help you actually apply and personalize the lessons that you have learned so that you can really put those in play. It's one thing to listen, it's a very different thing to actually act on what you've learned. Some of them have self-assessments that you can take. A number of them have ways that you can plan out how to apply things, and we're really excited to share it. We are also going to release a drip course version that has additional resources included. For example, a lot of people through their local libraries have access to LinkedIn Learning courses for free. And there are several courses that really support the topics that have been covered this season. We do want you to get the most out of this and to be able to make changes in your life. Our goal is to positively affect the lives of 10,000 women. And so we look forward to sharing more with you about that. It is going to release in July. And again, you need to be signed up for the email newsletter at www.calltotheworkforce.com. Use the pop-up to go to our Substack page and subscribe to the newsletter where we will be sharing all of these resources. With that, thank you for listening today, and we hope you have a great day.